Welcome to Wrestling with Giants. Last time, we asked whether Jesus is true God, and found that question resting on a much older one. Is there anything eternal in a world where everything, eventually, falls apart? The early church's answer locked together two things: an unchanging God, and the hope that this same God's undying life could rescue dying people. Ancient critics like Celsus attacked that answer directly, and the pressure of defending it quietly pulled the church's picture of Jesus' suffering towards something less than fully real, a tension the book promises to untangle much later in chapter 6. Today, the question flips completely. Now let's jump forward in time, through the Renaissance, through the Enlightenment, the era that placed human reason at the center of thought, into the age of modern science and technology. During this period, the relationship between human beings and nature completely flips. Ancient people depended on natural forces they could not understand or control. Floods, droughts, and disease left people helpless, and in that helplessness, they searched for God. But in the modern age, this situation reverses. Nature and history slowly become dependent on human beings instead. Humanity begins to take control of nature. This shift changes the very question people ask. The question is no longer, how do I live alongside the gods? It becomes, how do I survive in a world with nuclear weapons, revolutions, and a broken natural balance? The urgent question of the modern age is this: how do we make this world, a world we now control, genuinely humane? Both the first question and this new one actually start the same way. Each one begins with a big, general idea, and then asks where Jesus fits inside it. The first question started with, what is an eternal being? This new question starts with, what does it mean to truly be human? The old question about Jesus was, is the eternal God present in Christ? The new question becomes, can Jesus be called God? And if so, in what sense and to what degree? The German thinker Johann Gottfried Herder captured this shift in a single line. Humanity is both the nature and the work of Christ. The old church had talked about God becoming human, incarnation, and alongside it, about human beings sharing in God's divine nature, a concept called theosis, or becoming divine. Now the center of the conversation shifts entirely. The debate is no longer about Jesus' divinity. It becomes about Jesus' real, authentic humanity, his awareness of God, his inner life, his freedom. Two of the biggest thinkers of the modern age work this out in different ways. For the philosopher Immanuel Kant, the true test of any religious claim was practical reason, whether an idea actually helps people live good, moral lives. Kant treated Jesus mainly as a kind of perfect idea, the living picture of a person fully devoted to goodness. For the theologian Friedrich Schleiermacher, the test was something else: a deep, inner God consciousness, an unshakable sense of closeness to God. Schleiermacher believed Jesus had this awareness of God at full strength, without a single gap from the beginning of his life to the end. In both cases, the point of comparison for Jesus was no longer eternal being. It was something inside a person, their moral will, or their inner awareness of God. An interesting reversal happens here. Events like the virgin birth or the resurrection, once treated as physical miracles proving Jesus was divine, now feel, to the modern mind, hard to accept, almost like pure myth. Meanwhile, Jesus' moral perfection, his sinlessness, gets explained in a new way as a moral miracle of God's love. The proof of his divinity moves from physical events to moral character. Here is a way to picture this whole shift. The old question looked down from heaven to earth. How did the eternal God up there come down into this human world? The new question does not look up at all. It stands firmly on the ground and looks sideways at another person. How genuinely human is this man? How well does he model what it means to be human? Jesus is no longer understood against the backdrop of God becoming man. Instead, he is understood in the foreground of humanity itself, as the model human being, a man fully devoted to God. This shift also changes what salvation means. In the old view, salvation was for the whole fading, decaying world. In the modern view, salvation narrows down to something much smaller and more personal, a clear conscience, an inner sense of who you are, a whole and unbroken personality. This new, modern way of asking about Jesus runs straight into one hard problem. If the real question is simply, what does a truly good, truly human life look like? Why does the answer have to be Jesus specifically? Think about it this way. If you are searching for a good teacher or a role model for how to live, plenty of names could serve that purpose. Moses, Socrates, Buddha, many wise and morally serious figures show up across history. If Jesus is being measured by a general human standard, a good conscience, an authentic life, freedom from illusion, then he can only ever be one good answer among several, not the only possible one. This is the sharpest modern challenge to placing Jesus at the center of everything. On what grounds can Christianity still claim that Jesus uniquely is the answer, rather than one wise teacher standing in a long, respectable line of others? Notice something else here, too. This modern question about Jesus' true humanity actually shares the same basic shape as the ancient question about his true divinity. Both start from something universal, an idea, a standard, and then ask where Jesus fits inside it. And both leave the same two things unresolved. What makes this one specific man, Jesus of Nazareth, different from anyone else who might fit the same standard? And what his abandonment by God on the cross actually means? Changing the starting point from eternal being to human authenticity does not by itself answer either question. There is a third question, though, and it does not come from either of these two directions. It walks in from completely different ground, the promises of the Old Testament, and Israel's hope for a Messiah, God's promised king. The person who first asked the question was John the Baptist. From prison, John sent his disciples to ask Jesus directly, "Are you he who is to come, or shall we look for another?" What makes Jesus' answer so interesting is its shape. He does not say, "Yes, I am God." He does not say, "Yes, I am the perfect human being." Instead, he says this, "Go and tell John what you see and hear. The blind receive their sight, and the lame walk. Lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear, and the dead are raised up, and the poor have good news preached to them. And blessed is he who takes no offense at me." This is an indirect answer. Jesus lets the events happening around him, the things people are seeing and hearing, speak on his behalf. These events themselves are the proof that the Messianic age, the age God's people have been waiting for, has arrived. And the last line matters too. "Blessed is he who takes no offense at me." Jesus already knows this indirect kind of answer will not satisfy everyone. He accepts that in advance. Here, Jesus' authority does not come from the doctrine of the incarnation. It does not come from being a model of perfect humanity. His authority comes from the future of God's kingdom, a future that is already beginning to break in around him. This is not the divine world descending into Jesus from above. It is not a human being finding his true identity reflected in Jesus. Instead, it is something else entirely. A new future, shared between God, humanity, and the world, is opening up right now. This question connects to the open questions left by the Old Testament, the promises found in apocalyptic writing about the end of history and God's final judgment, and the real, lived experience of Israel through exile and displacement. This is not simply a case of a prophecy being ticked off as fulfilled. It runs deeper than that. Jesus' life and history were understood and experienced in a way unique to Israel, as genuinely open toward God's future. This is a very different kind of openness from the general, abstract question the Greeks asked about human limitation. It is also different from the general modern question about human nature we just looked at. This Jewish question never became a thing of the past. Its basic shape still shows up today, alive within Judaism and in atheistic forms of messianic hope. The deepest difference between Jews and Christians ultimately comes down to how each group relates to the crucified Christ. For Christians, this question becomes a challenge to reopen the door toward messianic hope and to find fresh grounds for hope inside a world that is not yet redeemed. So far, we've added 2 more questions to the first. Is Jesus true man? Turned the ancient question upside down. Instead of asking whether the eternal God came down into Jesus, it asked how genuinely, authentically human he really was, which immediately raised the hardest modern challenge of all. Why Jesus and not Socrates, or Buddha, or Moses? And are you he who is to come? Showed us a completely different way of asking. Not a Greek philosophical question at all, but Israel's own messianic hope, a question that never went away. One question is left, the strangest reversal of all, where Jesus stops answering questions and starts asking one himself. So far, we have looked at 3 questions. Is Jesus true God? Is Jesus true man? And are you he who is to come? These 3 questions share one thing in common. In every case, it is people asking questions about Jesus. Jesus stands in the position of being examined, the one who has to give an answer. But near the end of this chapter, something surprising happens. In the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the 3 New Testament books that tell Jesus' story from a similar viewpoint, the question about who Christ is does not only come from other people toward Jesus, it also comes from Jesus himself. The man who has only appeared as an answer to other people's questions suddenly turns around and asks his own disciples a question. He asks them who he is. The scene appears in Matthew chapter 16. Jesus asks his disciples, "Who do men say that the Son of Man is?" They answer, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." These answers reveal something. People at the time were trying to understand Jesus by fitting him into a familiar pattern. One of the great figures from Israel's history somehow returned to life. A revived prophet, more or less. But it doesn't stop there. Jesus immediately follows up with a sharper question. But who do you say that I am? Simon Peter answers, You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Jesus responds, Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. This scene matters enormously. Jesus' question here is not a test where he already knows the correct answer in advance. Jesus' own response to Peter's confession shows this. This was a genuinely open question. In other words, the Jesus of the Synoptic Gospels is speaking about himself indirectly, through the shape of a question rather than a statement. He reveals who he is not by answering, but by asking. Why does this final reversal matter so much? Let's look back at the first three questions. All three began inside some kind of universal framework. The first question began inside a metaphysical framework, a general question about eternal being. The second began inside an anthropological framework, a general question about what it means to be human. The third began inside a historical framework, Israel's messianic hope. Of these three, the third one deserves special attention. It is not simply one option among equals. Properly understood, the messianic question actually contains the other two questions inside itself. The question of God and the question of humanity, and reaches wider than both of them. It is, in a real sense, the earliest and the broadest of the three ways people have asked about Christ. Even so, each of these three frameworks can reveal something true about Jesus, this one specific person, and each of them can also hide him. Inside any universal framework, both belief and unbelief remain possible. The framework itself does not determine the answer. The key to this problem is this: whatever tentative answer any of these questions gives has to be revised, reinterpreted, and fundamentally reshaped by Jesus himself. This specific person, his actual history, and above all, his death on the cross. Whether we call him the incarnate Son of God, the Redeemer, or the model human being, no universal concept can be genuinely Christian unless it stays anchored to this one particular person in history. Here is a helpful picture. Imagine someone standing far away from a mountain, sketching its shape. Depending on which direction they stand, the mountain's outline looks completely different. From the east, it looks like a sharp peak. From the west, it looks like a gentle ridge. But the real mountain is not fully captured by either sketch. It holds all of these different appearances inside itself, and yet no single sketch, or even all the sketches combined, ever fully contains it. The Greek metaphysical angle, the modern anthropological angle, the Jewish messianic angle, each one genuinely captures a real feature of Jesus, but none of them, even taken together, can ever replace Jesus himself. Because Jesus does not simply sit there as the object of the sketch. He turns around and asks the person holding the pencil a question of his own. Is this mountain you've drawn really me? So no matter what form a question about Jesus takes, one thing has to be true if that question really wants to respect who he is. The relationship cannot be one of interrogation. It has to be one of being questioned in return. It cannot be a relationship that only demands an answer. It has to be one that is willing to give an answer too. If Jesus is treated only as an object to be questioned, we never actually make contact with him. We only make contact with whatever assumptions were already built into our question from the start. Today we followed 4 questions. Is Jesus true God? Led us into the doctrine of the Incarnation and into the old assumption that God must be a being who cannot suffer. Is Jesus true man? Led us into the reversed concern of the modern age, a question about genuine humanity rather than divinity, and into the sharpest challenge that question raises. Why Jesus and not Socrates, or Buddha, or Moses? Are you he who is to come? Led us into a completely different landscape. Not Greek metaphysics, but Israel's messianic hope, wide enough to hold the other 2 questions inside it. And finally, who do you say that I am? Placed us in the position of being questioned ourselves by the very person we had been questioning all along. The goal of this chapter was never to pick one of these 4 questions and stop there. Even the widest of them, the messianic question, still has to keep facing Jesus himself. This specific man who lived in Galilee, crucified under a Roman governor. That is exactly why the cross keeps breaking open every fixed picture we try to build of him, the way we described at the start of this episode. No title, however carefully built, gets the final word. Only Jesus does. Next episode picks up exactly here. Episode 5 covers Chapter 4, the historical trial of Jesus. It traces, through real history, why the religious leaders of Jesus' own time and the Roman authorities actually condemned him. Episode 6 covers Chapter 5, the eschatological trial of Jesus Christ. The word eschatological comes from a Greek word for the last things. It means anything to do with God's final future, the end and completion of history. This episode asks what it means that this same executed man was raised from the dead, and how that changes the way we read his death. Today gave us the questions and the frameworks people bring to Jesus. The next 2 episodes bring those frameworks down onto the actual ground of history. I'll see you there.